Do you understand that in the event you are taken hostage, you will not be negotiated for? Yes, I answered as I walked through the gates of San Quentin for the very first time. 10 minutes later, I found myself seated next to a man who was far too young to be where he was, in violence prevention class. His name was Michael, and he was 19 years old, and he'd been in prison for 2 months. There was something about him that just exuded utter grief and sadness. And my first impression was, what happened to this guy? The phrases moment of imminent danger and sitting in the fire were very familiar to the men in the class, but were all new to Michael and I. The men in the class could easily describe what happens between anger and a crime, craving and using. Sitting in the fire was about sitting with pain and discomfort long enough to let it teach you. Near the end of class, Michael raises his hand and in a tone of complete desperation says, "What happened to me? I killed my best friend and it happened in seconds. What happened to me?" With tears streaming down his face, he said, "I miss him every day, and I cannot believe that I did this." After a long pause, one of the men in the class said, "That's why you're here, so that you understand exactly what happened to you so you never have to go to that place again." When I left, thoughts, feelings, and questions stayed with me for weeks. Questions like, accountability and justice are important, and prisons are a means of that. But what are we doing when people actually get there? How are we doing prisons? Accountability is an important element to create the environment for change, but how can transformation happen in this place? The us and them started to shift for me, and I started thinking about the men as fathers, as grandfathers, as uncles, as people caring about their families and trying to figure out their lives. I am not a psychologist or a mental health expert. I am a business professional working with early stage and growth companies for the last 25 years. That's what got me to San Quentin. I was asked to work with a program that has evolved into what is now known as GRIP, Guiding Rage into Power. I was very skeptical, but also very curious about prison programs. And here I am, 9 years later, learning more about human growth and personal transformation than I ever imagined from these men behind bars. So I want to start a conversation today about what the financial and social costs are of ignorance, insensitivity, and lack of deep human connection. In other words, no empathy. What are the costs to individuals, to our communities, and to our society as a whole? But first, I want to talk about a couple of important elements of empathy. Listening. What does it mean to listen really well? It means hearing the words, but also interpreting those words into meaning. It means witnessing with no judgment. Dr. Rachel Naomi Remen, who is a renowned cancer physician, states, "It is often the quality of our listening, not the wisdom of our words, that has the most profound effect in those around us." So what about connection? We all seek to be loved. We all seek to belong and to connect. We don't experience the same things, but we can relate to the emotions that somebody is feeling. This connection is empathy. So what happens when we don't listen and we don't witness and we don't connect? One of the young men in the prison was asked, "Why do you keep going in and out of prison?" He looked around before answering and he said, "It's better to be wanted by the police than to not be wanted at all. And it's better to be held in prison than to have nobody hold you." This kind of alienation creates systemic issues. Nonviolent communication author Marshall Rosenberg states, "Violence is always a tragic expression of unmet needs." So what are the social costs to this? Individually, it can create anger and frustration. My 6-year-old niece taught me this several years ago. I was in the kitchen, very distracted, a lot was going on, and she was desperately trying to get my attention. After a while, her frustration boiled over and she clenched her fists and she pounded her arms and she said, "Listen to me," about 3 times. It was a great mirror for me that what I was doing was making her feel invisible and unheard. Clearly things that I would never want her to become accustomed to feeling. Disconnection happens in communities also. I spent my childhood in Oakland, California, where I could go door to door selling Girl Scout cookies at 7 years old. A couple of miles away, in the same town, in a different part of Oakland, kids couldn't play outside regularly because of gangs and drug dealers and gunshots. We were a city in name only. So what are the societal costs? What are the systemic costs that we see? Let's look at social media as an indicator. I'm on Facebook to communicate with friends around the world. I've done online dating. I get the appeal and the usefulness. But in my view, there is an implicit promise of the hope of being seen and of connecting that leaves us wanting something deeper and more meaningful. This hope of connection keeps us addicted to social media, which is a very poor substitute. Growing social networking industries are financially and strategically banking on our need for connection and empathy. What about the growing cost of violence? Let me illustrate with a few statistics. 1 in 34 Americans is either incarcerated, on probation, or on parole. If we add a filter of race to this, 1 in 9 is Black, 1 in 27 is Hispanic, and 1 in 45 is white. 1 in 28 school-aged children have an incarcerated parent, and they are 5 times more likely than their counterparts to end up in prison. When a prisoner is released, they are often sent back to where they came from. No money, no job, no housing, and no skills to behave their way into a different kind of life. So what are the financial costs of all of this? I think they're staggering. $80 billion is the budget for corrections in the United States. $60,000 is how much it costs us in California to house one prisoner for 1 year. 1 in 4 prisoners in California is life sentenced, and 58% of those who are released come back within 3 years. Education has been cut to the bone, and public safety programs have been outsourced to volunteers and nonprofits. Since 1980, our spending on higher education has decreased 13%, and our spending on corrections has increased 400%. We are clearly investing in walls, not in relationships. So what do we do about this? What can we all do about this? We can practice empathy. It's not hard, it just takes practice. It's different than doing our annual soup kitchen visits or writing our checks to our favorite charity at the end of the year. Don't get me wrong, those things are great, they're really important. But this is different. It requires a presence of self, and that requires a little bit more. I want to describe to you some of the things that we use to practice empathy. The first is stop. Stop, process, and observe. I teach scuba diving as an avocation that I really, really enjoy, and I quickly learned as a new instructor that it takes 3 seconds for somebody to panic underwater. When they feel their life is threatened, their eyes go all over the place, their face gets flushed with adrenaline, and they want to shoot for the surface, which is the most dangerous thing you can do in scuba diving. My job is to catch them before this happens and get them to stop. This is the underwater sign for stop. The second thing is you look at me, get them to connect. Try to get them to look at me. The third thing, breathe. When they breathe, everything calms down, and we go off for a really wonderful dive exploration. The same thing happens above ground that happens underwater. It's seconds from the time that anger can actually turn into something dreadful. Intervening in that moment to actually stop, to get yourself together and to calm down is really important. Second, grow my emotional intelligence. So what does that mean? I think of it as understanding my emotional inheritance. So just as I watch my cholesterol because my family has a history of heart disease, I also practice really good boundaries and a lot of self-reflection when I get triggered because of the mental illness that dots my family tree. My curiosity about these inherited patterns that have come from generation to generation, it caused me to explore these things and deepen my understanding and grow my emotional intelligence. Third, cultivating mindfulness. We hear a lot about mindfulness these days, so what does it mean? It's knowing the difference between a reaction and a response. Let me tell you a quick story. Several years ago, I worked for a yoga clothing company. And the first week I was there, I was in a meeting, and all of a sudden this voice comes over the loudspeaker and says, "This is Jason in the warehouse, and I'm about to ring the gong." All of a sudden, a great big gong noise comes through. People get up from their chairs, lay on the floor, close their eyes, they're breathing. I'm looking around like, what in the world has happened? A few minutes later, the gong rings, they all come back to their chairs, seemingly refreshed, and get right back to work. I very quickly learned to love that gong. Those few minutes every day to just relax and get in touch with where the tension was in my body helped me to not just react to things throughout the rest of the day. Fourth, understanding victim impact. We call this restorative justice in the corrections field, and this is that 3 to 10 second that I've talked about that often has huge impacts and lasting impacts on those around us. It took Michael seconds to kill his best friend. So I want to illustrate this by going back to grip class. There are 29 life-sentenced men in the class, and they call themselves a tribe. They name their tribe by the collective years that they have served already, which is often between 600 and 800 years. So Tribe 742 will also collectively pull together the time that they lost from that moment of imminent danger to when their crimes were completed, often less than 25 minutes. They will then spend the next 52 weeks looking at the many lives they've impacted, including their own, by those 25 minutes. So in closing, I want to tell you a story. I went back to visit grip class, and it was near the end of the 52 weeks. A world-class somatic psychologist named Jacques Verdun teaches this class, and he's dedicated his life to this work. There are 4 prisoner facilitators who are there for support and also learning to teach the classes. It's the last hour of class, and we split into groups of 6. It's Sam's turn to basically give his history of violence that he's worked on for the last year. Nervously, he unfolds this meticulously filled out, oversized spreadsheet that talks about his history, major events that have happened, who was present, what does he remember feeling physically, what does he remember feeling emotionally, and so on. He only looks at me as he talks. For a minute, I wondered what was going on. And then I realized this was my invitation to practice empathy and to listen. And was I willing to do that? Yes. Sam begins by describing the first defining incident of violence that he remembers. He was 8 years old, and he recalls his father brutally beating up his mother. It was the first time he felt vengeance. He continues on, and by the time he reaches 14, my stomach is tight and my throat is clenched, and I feel like I'm just going to peel over into tears. I quickly look at the other men in the group. 2 of them have hand on stomach, hand on heart, in a physical show of holding support for Sam. Another man has his hand on Sam's back, physically connecting with him to show support. I continue to keep my gaze on Sam. He continues with his autobiography of traumas perpetrated and received, murders witnessed, suicide, abuse, significant alienation, and deep, deep losses. He gets to later in his life where he and his girlfriend have moved into a new apartment together. They get into a heated accusatory argument. He begins to describe the murder he committed. Before he finishes, he collapses into deep, wailing sobs of anguish. I've never seen somebody in so much despair. He collapses into the shame of what he's done, and he has his hands over his face. Jacques intervenes. Sam, make eye contact with somebody in the group. He can't. Jacques gets on his knees and raises his hands and says, Sam, take my hands. Sam takes Jacques' hands. Sam, I want you to look at me, Jacques says. Sam looks at Jacques. Deep breath, wails to sobs. I want you to look at somebody in the group. I want you to make eye contact. Sam looks at me. Sam looks at me. A waterfall of apology begins. I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. I begin to think, how am I going to respond to this? When a sense of calm comes over me, and I think about his girlfriend Sherry standing behind me with her hand on my shoulder, and I say to Sam, I accept your apology for her. Jacques intervenes again. Would you repeat that, Kris? I accept your apology for her. Sam, is there anything you would like to say to her loved ones, to her family? Sam takes a deep breath, and he begins to describe, in a very thoughtful way, the countless ways in which he's hurt so many. Our discussion ends only because class does, and I leave San Quentin that day physically and emotionally overwhelmed. I can't stop thinking about Sam and Sherry. So I decide to write the men in the class a letter for the following week's class. I write that Sam's background and mine are connected. I have a grandmother who was a victim of domestic violence. And while she had the great strength to walk away from her abuser, never to return to that situation, for which I'm very grateful, what she did not have was the emotional skills and the support to change the patterns that accompany that physical abuse. It was no coincidence that Sam chose me to talk to that day. I wrote that I had seen a heartbroken, shamed, vulnerable, courageous man show me what remorse looks like, and that he had given me an apology. I was grateful to Sam's proxy for me, and I had wondered all week long, who was standing behind Sam giving me a much-needed apology? I was grateful to learn empathy and to experience empathy in this way. I was grateful that Sam gave me permission to share his part of our story. It was a most unusual gift that I received in San Quentin that day. We have a saying in prison, hurt people, and healed people heal people. We all yearn to heal and to be healed. Empathy is the gift that we have to give. When we choose to give it, it transforms our lives. When we choose not to, it's expensive. So I leave all of you with my story and with a question. How will you and you and you and I choose to give our gifts of empathy? Thank you.